Those of you who are here, thank you. I just wanted to say we do have a Twitter account. If you wanted to tweet, it's NEDSI.org. So we encourage you to participate in that. And also we have a LinkedIn account as well if you look for Northeast Decision Sciences. So again, thank you for coming. I'd like to talk to you about energy efficient greenhouses. You may think, well, what the heck is that? So I'm going to talk about what that actually means. And some of the work that I've been doing. Those of you who have possibly been at some of these other sessions that I've done, this is kind of an extension of some of the work that I've done. I'm faculty at Business School at Penn State. So what I'm going to try to do is really just kind of scope out what a controlled environment, agricultural system is. I mean, does anybody know what that means? Okay, so I'll go over what that means and then what the research that I'm doing around that. I teach entrepreneurship and I also teach creativity in business. Very interested in small business startups. One of the ones that is, I think is a good one is the provision of urban farms. So that is growing closer to the major population centers in the United States and elsewhere. So I'm going to talk about the reasons for that and so on, and this study that I'm looking at. I'm also, acknowledge some of the work that I've done has been supported through in partnership with the USDA and Phillips as well as Penn State. Okay, so let me just kind of jump into the justification for this and why I think this is an important area. It really is based on a number of trends, really going back to population growth, which is driving migration and food issues, and then in terms of the environment, land, water, and energy. So let me go into each one of those pieces. If we look at population growth, as we know, it continues to rise. It's rising faster in less developed countries than in more developed countries. We see this, that the Earth is going to be populated by between 9 and 10 billion people by 2050. So we need to figure out how to feed all those folks. We also see simultaneously a trend taking place towards migration to cities. There's been clustering, and actually just in the past couple of years, we've passed this point where there are more people living in the majority of the world's population is now in urban areas as opposed to rural areas around the world. Oops. Okay, and you also can see that there's almost a billion people in the world who are suffering from hunger. So this is an issue, and it's differential across the globe. If you look at the red areas, these are really areas that are particularly hard hit. Other parts of the world not having as much problem, but it is a global problem. So, okay, so let's look at, that was really the demand side. Let's look at the supply side of this equation. The cost to produce food continue to rise. As you can see from these charts, seed, fertilizer, pesticides, fuels, almost everything has gone up significantly and will continue to go. Will continue to go up. It can point to the fact fuels, energy continues to go up, and so on. So these are not particularly good trends when you're trying to produce food. The other issue too is that our demand for energy continues to go up significantly. As you can see, it's projected to be significantly higher by 2035. So we're not using energy. We're not using less energy. We still need to produce a fair amount of energy. But at the same time, what should be striking about this chart is that the amount of arable land is flat. All right, there's only a finite amount of arable land where you can grow crops effectively. It's not changing. So the fact is, what do we do about that? And the other problem is that the distribution of arable land in the United States, but throughout the world, is differential. As you can see, the areas that have more or less are colored darker. The ones that don't have much arable land, as you can see, large swaths of the globe don't have arable land. So there's all sorts of issues around that. So the question is, how are we going to feed all these people? We can't truck or we can't fly food all over the globe. We need to, localize that. So what do you do when you don't have enough arable land? And then finally, water use. Water use is probably going to be as significant, and conflicts over water are going to be as significant as conflicts over oil and other fossil fuels. So you can see, though, that agriculture withdraws by as much as 69, almost 70% of the water that's used around the world, fresh water and otherwise, is used for agriculture. Industry is 19% and municipalities 12%. So huge amount of water being used for that. And as you can see, that there are large portions of the earth that are in water scarcity conditions, again, which is going to give rise to more and more conflicts. But it really does threaten how do we grow food. You need water, you need energy, you need sunlight, you need all these other things to feed all this growing population. So the question is, how do we do that? Okay, so what I want to introduce is urban agriculture as a sustainable solution to meeting future demand for food. And this is essentially an office building filled with food. All right, so let me try to explain what that is. So essentially what we're trying to do is, so here are some of the requirements if we want to build a sustainable food production system. So we're going to need to increase production yields by 80%, grow food with less water, energy, and other inputs based on their availability. There's a movement towards localization, or the locavore movement. Many of you may subscribe to, farmers markets and so on, local to you. And then there's kind of a movement too to price according to the actual costs. There is some sort of, there is a little bit of a disconnect between actual cost and just on an intuitive level, does it make sense to truck things 3,000 miles from California to the East Coast? Or to train it. It's actually part of the train system. And then this increased emphasis on organics and so on have kind of pushed us to reconsider where we grow our food, especially in the United States. And again, when the fact is that arable land is relatively fixed, you can't just sort of manufacture it. The question is, what do you do? Okay, so some of the characteristics of urban farms, they're essentially farms that are co-located.
Were those percentages from a U.S. perspective or a world
U.S. perspective, the last slide. So urban farms are co-located in urban areas. We bring the food, right? Remember, migration to cities, more people are living in cities, so urban farm essentially grows food within, say, a 25 or 50 mile radius within the metropolitan area. And so it's going to reduce food distribution costs consequently. What you can do is, there are certain techniques I'll show you that you can grow more in less space, and that is especially if you start to grow vertically, right? So hence the skyscraper that is growing food. You can reduce or eliminate pests and pesticides, because if you grow inside, let's say in a warehouse, there are a relatively small amount of pests. You can still, some very large systems that are under glass or inside, you can use some integrated pest management techniques, but it's much more controllable. Or you can do without the pesticides entirely. So it's a great development. The nice thing too about, say, for example, hydroponic systems, which are water-based systems, use only 10% of the amount of water that you would use in an open irrigation type system. So that's really astounding. These recirculating systems allow you to grow with 90% less water, which is really, really significant. Because think about it, the water goes into the ground and then it goes down to the water table, and it's not going to be reclaimed unless you've got some sort of pumping mechanism. So you essentially lose that water, at least for the time being. So this whole kind of area of urban farms is built around the concept of controlled environment agriculture. It's an advanced and intensive form of hydroponically based agriculture. Plants are grown within a controlled environment. So think of, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Martian.
Yeah.
Yeah. How many of you saw that? That is essentially a controlled environment agriculture, and not coincidentally, some of the advisors to that come from, I know some of the folks out at the University of Arizona, and they have a whole center on controlled environment agriculture, and they consult with NASA, and they are helping them figure out, because think about it, we're not going to be able to, propel cabbages into space. We're going to have to grow the cabbages from the seed, because seed is much lighter than so on. So we're going to have to eventually, if we're serious about space travel and colonization of other planets and so on, we're going to have to bring food, we're going to have to grow food in space. So there's all sorts of interesting research that I've discovered around growing under these conditions, but these things can also apply to us here on Earth.
Are those the people who did the Biodome?
No, that's a different group, and that's a whole. It was actually I'm on a webinar series with them, and they just did kind of like what's going on with Everybody know what Biodome is? Biodome is out in Arizona. It goes back into the 70s really, and it was an attempt to kind of create this biosphere, second Earth, under glass. Very interesting stuff. I'm not going to go into that, but as you know, it's very interesting. So so a typical, now this is ICEA, means indoor. That's what I'm doing. Indoor controlled environment agriculture system. You have some form of supplemental lighting. All right, you might have some natural light, but you're going to have to supplement it, especially if you grow vertically, because even if you have some light coming on the top level, you still have to light the lower levels. Plants are dumb. They need a certain amount of energy to grow. And one of the biggest problems, how many of you are gardeners or otherwise, right? One of the reasons why your plants will die is because they get too cold, they don't get enough light, or they don't get enough water. Usually water is not the problem. We usually overwater them, but light is really the problem. They need about 10 times the amount of light to produce leaves and flowers and stuff that we need to see. So, this light would be insufficient to grow a plant. You're going to need 10 times this amount so it's really quite bright. You need some sort of circulation system if you're inside, right? You need to move the air, right? So it's mixing and it mimics conditions outside. You're going to have to control the air, right? If it's going to be excessively hot, plants work within a certain range of temperatures and humidities that work well. You're going to need water, of course, and you're going to need power, and you're going to need a means of bringing fresh air into the system. Why? Because you need to refresh the CO2 that the plants are going to absorb, right? So there's you're building a whole kind of ecosystem inside. All right, so the question I became interested in is from both an environmental sustainability perspective, but also from an entrepreneurial perspective. Can these be profitable? Can you do this inside profitably? Does it make sense? And that's kind of the ongoing question that I'm trying to address. So the study that I'm currently doing is a cost-benefit analysis of this type of thing in urban farm. All right, so let me go through how I'm doing this, what sorts of things I'm involved in here. So as I said, the issue here is, if the hypothesis is that by carefully selecting inputs, controlling for environmental factors, a closed-loop indoor agricultural system can be profitable and sustainable from at least the single bottom line perspective, and as well, I think, from a double bottom line perspective. So let's look at the design of the study. So it's really essentially a field study, a quasi-experimental study, because I am able to control a number of the variables, but not all variables. And it's field study because I'm actually building a system to do this, which I'm going to show you pictures of in just a minute. The variables include the cost of energy, cost of goods sold, which I'll talk about in a minute. Controls are the creating the optimal environmental conditions for the plants to grow, and of course the outputs are the plants themselves. So I'm actually doing this. I'm becoming an urban farmer as a result of this project. All right, so let's take a quick look at the inputs of this. So the input variables are all reduced to dollars, and they include the operational cost including environmental control, nutrients, production control, and labor. Capital cost include the building structure, HVAC, and so on and so forth. My control variables, my control variables is being able to set. So a lot of research has been done in horticulture to optimize, and in this case, I'm looking at lettuces. So how do you grow the perfect lettuce? And there's some wonderful studies that have been done at Cornell University and other schools around the schools of agriculture around the country that have kind of said, this is the amount of light you need, these are the nutrient solutions that work, so on and so forth. These are the optimal levels, velocity of air, everything else that goes into that. And then the output variables are the plant quality and quantity, and then of course in the end the market value. You can charge for that. All right. So this is just another way of looking at your inputs, controls, and your outputs. In terms of that. So that's essentially how the study is organized. Okay, any questions? Okay, so here's just a breakdown. Your climate control costs include the light, heating and cooling, fans and pumps, which are all going to be measured in kilowatt hours or dollars. Your growing system costs include water, nutrients, water conditioners. So one of the things is you need to make sure your pH is properly adjusted, your nutrient levels are set at the right level. Every plant has a different type of nutrient level. And then of course your heating and cooling costs. The cost of goods sold, or the direct costs there to produce seeds, something called stone wool, and then these little miniature, they're called net pots. Capital costs include all the building costs, heating and cooling equipment, ventilation equipment, lighting, monitoring equipment, and control equipment, and then of course labor, time to germinate, transplant, and then to harvest ultimately. Okay. So here's how the control variables, the things that we have to control for are the light levels, make sure we have enough light, and something called the photoperiod. The photoperiod is how long do you keep the light on, right? Mm-hmm. So different plants have different requirements there. Some, there are some plants that actually can go 24 hours. They don't need a break, but most plants need a break from the light so that they can kind of stop photosynthesis and do other things, to maintain the health of the plant. So typically you might have light for 12, 16, 18 hours a day with some sort of resting maybe of 6 to 8 hours, and that's very common. Well, that's to an advantage then, is that you need to then calculate your light levels based on, say, a 16-hour a day as opposed to a 24-hour period. So you would need to raise them. Plants again are stupid, but they're integrating in the sense that it's the time of light exposure that integrates over that time, which results in something called the daily light integral. In other words, you can give them a small amount of light for a longer period or a big amount of light for a short period, and they don't care. As long as you don't burn them. If you get too much light, you can get something called tip burn, but as long as you're not kind of blasting them into outer space, they'll be fine. So that gives you some degrees of control as well. You can also adjust the wavelength of the light to produce more flowering or more leaf growth. So for example, I grow basil this way, and if you blue shift the light, my basil leaves, which normal basil leaves are about this big, mine are the size of my hand, because I force all the photosynthesis, I force all into leaf production, all the, because that's what happens. Red shifted light goes towards production of flowers and fruiting, and blue shifted light the other way. Okay, so you have to we also maintain the temperature, the humidity, CO2 levels. Now you can do CO2 enrichment. I don't in this context. I'm just using standard atmospheric, just trying to maintain it around 400 parts per million. But you can bring that up to 1,000 or even 1,500 parts per million. Plants do like that. You can accelerate their growth, but of course that's another cost. And then air velocity. You need a little bit of movement for the air, not too much and not